The morning began like any other. A wealthy businessman stepped out of his apartment to pick up breakfast, unaware that every step was being shadowed. The streets bustled with the usual rhythm of the city, yet within minutes, everything changed. Three sharp cracks echoed through the air, gunfire in broad daylight. Witnesses froze, shocked by the sudden violence. The victim collapsed just steps from safety as chaos rippled through the neighborhood. Who pulled the trigger? And why was this man a target? Behind the precision of the attack lay a story of wealth, betrayal, and secrets that would take decades to fully unravel. If you're a fan of true crime and criminal investigations, you won't want to miss our new book, The Ultimate Book of Serial Killers: 180 Files of the World's Most Notorious Murderers, now available on Amazon. You can also purchase the PDF version directly from our website for instant download. You'll find the link in the video description and in a pinned comment. Now, let's dive into today's case. Barbara Cogan came into the world in 1943 in New Jersey, the second daughter of a prosperous Jewish family. Her father was a successful businessman, and Barbara grew up surrounded by privilege. From an early age, she was drawn to elegance and glamour. The finer things in life seemed to call her name. Those who knew her described a young woman who was stylish, polished, and always perfectly put together, with a love for designer fashion and sparkling jewelry. Her education took her to Hunter College in Manhattan, where she stood out as bright, outgoing, and socially active. Beneath that charm was also a clear desire for success and recognition. Barbara had many interests, but one stood out early: dance. In high school, she developed a passion for it, convincing her parents to let her pursue lessons. By 16, her talent had carried her to victory in a New Jersey dance competition. The prize was the chance to appear in a music video for Capitol Records, one of America's biggest labels. The video never materialized, yet the moment only strengthened Barbara's determination to perform. During her college years, Barbara found her way onto Broadway stages, part of New York's vibrant theater scene. She also nurtured her love for art, choosing art history as her field of study, and often spent her free time painting. Friends remembered her as intelligent, ambitious, and magnetic, qualities that naturally drew attention. Suitors were plenty, but Barbara was selective. She wasn't looking for just anyone. She wanted a man with ambition and drive, someone who matched her own hunger for success. That man appeared in 1961. After one of Barbara's performances, a young audience member approached her. His name was George Cogan. Like her, George appreciated the arts, but what struck Barbara most was his determination. He was studying business in New York and carried himself with the confidence of someone intent on building a future. Their connection was immediate. George began taking her to fine restaurants and showering her with gifts, gestures that made an impression. Barbara assumed George's background was similar to her own, but the reality was far grander. George belonged to one of Puerto Rico's wealthiest families, heirs to a fortune built from a chain of department stores. At the time, the Cogan family's wealth was estimated at $40 million, a staggering sum for the 1960s. George's story began far from the glamour of Manhattan. He had been born in Puerto Rico on September 25, 1941, into a dynasty of wealth and ambition. His grandfather, Salomon Kogan, had immigrated from Minsk and built a thriving retail empire. George's father expanded it further, investing in real estate and solidifying the family's status as one of the island's most prominent. George grew up with every privilege, but his childhood wasn't without shadows. His mother was said to favor his older brother, often belittling George and leaving him with low self-esteem. Despite that, George forged ahead. In the 1960s, he moved to Manhattan to study at New York University's business school, determined to follow in his father's footsteps. For George, meeting Barbara was more than romance. It was the beginning of a partnership between two ambitious souls, each carrying the weight of family expectations and each striving for a future filled with success, beauty, and recognition. In 1964, 3 years after their first meeting, Barbara and George Kogan married. For George, the timing was more than romantic, it was practical. Marriage granted him an exemption from military service, something he had managed to delay through his studies. Some would later suggest that avoiding the draft was the real reason he hurried into marriage, though only George knew his true intentions. After the ceremony, Barbara moved with her new husband to Puerto Rico, where she was introduced to George's extensive family and the many properties he controlled. As a wedding gift of sorts, the couple received a hotel to manage and a stylish apartment to call their own. For Barbara, who had grown up with comfort but never expected such opulence, it was a revelation. Life promised both affection and luxury, and she embraced it wholeheartedly. Like many young couples, Barbara and George dreamed of raising children. But as months turned into years without success, they turned to adoption. In 1966, they welcomed a baby boy they named Scott. Just weeks later, Barbara discovered she was pregnant. The news felt like a miracle, and within 9 months, their second son William was born. The family was complete, and Barbara took great pride in shaping the image of their new life. She became known for her devotion to fashion and her impeccable sense of style. With wealth at her disposal, Barbara was said to spend as much as $100,000 a year on her wardrobe alone. While the boys were young, her focus was motherhood. But as they grew older, she became more involved in George's ventures, assisting with the hotel and carving out a role in the business. On the surface, the Kogan marriage seemed almost enviable. They enjoyed horseback riding, weekends at the stables, and glamorous parties that Barbara hosted with flair. Together they invested in property, opened a jewelry store, and expanded their businesses. George had fulfilled his dream of becoming a businessman in his father's image, while Barbara thrived in the world of luxury she adored. The couple also traveled extensively and persuaded Barbara's own parents and sister to move to Puerto Rico. There, her family also established businesses of their own, further strengthening the network of privilege and success around them. Barbara became a striking figure in local society, often described as one of the best-dressed women on the island, a woman who drew attention wherever she went. After 25 years of marriage, however, both Barbara and George felt the need for change. In 1987, they left behind their comfortable life in Puerto Rico and relocated to New York City. George saw opportunity in Manhattan's competitive real estate and antiques markets, while Barbara envisioned herself stepping into the glamorous social circles she had always dreamed about. They arrived with wealth and reputation intact, but beneath the polished surface, their marriage was no longer what it seemed. Rumors suggested that Barbara was the driving force behind the move, hoping to revive a relationship that had cooled into companionship. Friends whispered that the couple no longer shared a bedroom. Barbara was said to criticize George's appearance, and George himself admitted that passion had long faded. To some, it appeared the marriage had never been built on deep love, but rather on ambition, appearances, and convenience. Rumors may have swirled about the Cogans, but outwardly the picture remained polished. They were seen as a refined couple with no public quarrels or scandals. When they settled in New York, they turned their attention to a new venture, an upscale store specializing in antiques, fine art, and jewelry. Barbara, with her lifelong passion for art, threw herself into the project. She chose the location, envisioned the layout, and made sure the shop reflected the kind of elegance she wanted associated with her name. Staff were carefully selected, and one in particular would soon play an outsized role in their lives, a young woman named Mary Louise Hawkins. Mary Louise came from a wealthy background and, though much younger than the Cogans, quickly earned their trust. She was tasked with marketing the business and ensuring its reputation remained untarnished. Her charm and diligence left a favorable impression, and Barbara herself was the one who introduced her to George at the store's glittering grand opening in November 1988. George was 47 at the time. Mary Louise was 28. That night, George reportedly commented to Barbara that Mary Louise was strikingly beautiful. Barbara laughed it off, even repeating the remark to Mary Louise herself. But after a few drinks, George repeated it again, this time less as a joke and more as an admission. Soon their paths began crossing frequently under the guise of business. Mary Louise devoted herself to the store's image, which was no small task. Staff had long complained that Barbara could be demanding, even harsh, and at times those complaints trickled to potential clients. It was often Mary Louise's job to smooth things over and repair reputational damage. George, meanwhile, began appearing at the store more and more, supposedly to monitor the business. In reality, he was finding excuses to spend time with Mary Louise. He would invent projects that required her late into the evening, then take her out for dinner as thanks. Conversations stretched into hours, and during those moments George revealed his unhappiness at home. He confided that he felt no real love for Barbara, that their marriage was hollow, and that intimacy had long since vanished. What Barbara knew of this dissatisfaction remains uncertain. Outwardly, she gave no hint of suspicion. By all accounts, she adored her husband, and she even liked Mary Louise, so much so that she once tried to set her up with her eldest son. But George's interest in Mary Louise only deepened. He eventually arranged a trip to Puerto Rico under the pretense of business. In truth, it was far more personal. By then, George and Mary Louise were no longer just employer and employee, they were lovers. Everything escalated quickly. By the end of 1988, George told Barbara outright that he wanted to be with Mary Louise and that he wanted a divorce. The revelation shattered Barbara, who had seen no warning signs. Practically overnight, George left the family home, taking up with his mistress while Barbara remained with their younger son, blindsided and devastated. Soon, George was traveling the world with Mary Louise, India, Florida, and other destinations, lavishing her with gifts. Barbara, still tied to his finances, saw the statements rolling in. She knew exactly where they were, how much was being spent, and who was benefiting. To her, the betrayal was not only emotional but financial, and the fury it stirred would follow her into the years ahead. Barbara did not take her husband's betrayal quietly. Determined to strike back, she contacted Mary Louise's employer, a respected company, and made her displeasure known. Before long, Mary Louise was dismissed. Yet the victory felt hollow. George was a millionaire, and his mistress no longer needed a paycheck to live comfortably. Barbara turned her focus to the divorce. In 1989, she filed, citing George's infidelity and arming herself with evidence, account statements, photographs, and proof of his extravagant spending on Mary Louise. She aimed high, requesting alimony, a share of the property, and financial support to cover legal expenses. Specifically, she asked for $5,000 a week in alimony, $100,000 to pay her lawyer, $25,000 for accountants, and close to $1 million for her share of the business and real estate. Barbara hired excellent attorneys, giving her case a strong foundation, but George, wealthy and well-connected, countered with even sharper legal representation. Almost immediately, her requests were denied. A second attempt failed as well, and to make matters worse, Barbara was suddenly cut off from the couple's joint accounts, even though the divorce proceedings were still ongoing. George also began to conceal assets, reporting a far smaller fortune than he actually possessed. Barbara knew he was lying, but she had no way to prove it. The battle turned uglier still when George accused her of stealing jewelry from their home, pieces he had originally bought for her during their marriage. Left with no access to funds, Barbara had to rely on her mother for help paying her mounting legal fees. Meanwhile, George continued traveling the world with Mary Louise, living extravagantly, while Barbara was forced to watch from the sidelines. Her anger and resentment grew with each passing month. Then came the morning of October 23, 1990. George and Mary Louise were living together in her Manhattan apartment. At around 9:30 a.m., George stepped out to buy breakfast. He walked to the market, purchased food, and began heading home. He didn't realize that someone was following him. Just steps from the building, 3 sharp cracks split the air. Gunshots. George had no chance to react. Witnesses saw the attack unfold in broad daylight. The gunman fled as George collapsed, bleeding on the pavement. A woman who lived in the same building rushed to his side while the concierge called for help. George was taken to the hospital in critical condition. Barbara, still legally his wife, was notified. She wrestled with whether to go to the hospital, but chose not to. Instead, she called her relatives, knowing full well that George's mistress was at his side. Hours later, around 4 p.m., the phone rang again, this time with the news that George had died. The aftermath exposed the fractured state of the Cogan family. George's parents, strained by his troubled marriage and scandalous affair, chose not to attend the funeral. Their absence left a striking void. Among those present was his 12-year-old niece, Taryn Cogan. She would later recall the day with piercing clarity. The weight of grief, the atmosphere heavy with whispers, and one image seared into her memory: Barbara, occasionally smirking amid the mourning crowd. The murder of George Cogan demanded a thorough investigation. From the very beginning, it was evident this was no random act of violence. 3 bullets struck him with precision, each targeting his heart. Detectives suspected that whoever pulled the trigger had acted with careful planning, possibly even a professional hitman. Witnesses described the assailant as tall, calm, and deliberate, someone who appeared to know exactly what he was doing. Police initially considered George's business history. Over the years, he had built and expanded ventures, sometimes taking out large loans. Though he always repaid them, at the time of his death, he still carried debts. Could his murder have stemmed from these financial dealings? The possibility lingered, but investigators soon turned to another, more personal lead: the divorce. Legally, Barbara was still George's wife, and she remained the beneficiary of his $4.2 million life insurance policy. That fact alone raised eyebrows. But Barbara had an alibi. She was at the hairdresser at the very hour George was gunned down. She was not the shooter, Yet suspicion around her motives deepened. Not long after, she withdrew $2 million from the policy. The remainder was withheld, pending further investigation. For a time, Barbara played the part of a grieving widow, arriving at the funeral in designer clothes tailored specifically for the occasion. But as the years passed, the investigation went cold. By 1996, no arrests had been made, and Barbara eventually received the second half of the insurance payout. Most people could have lived comfortably with such wealth, but Barbara burned through the money quickly. Within years it was gone, and she even filed for bankruptcy. The case remained open, and suspicion circled back to Barbara. Detectives found that George's business dealings were relatively clean. He had few true enemies. The only person with a clear financial incentive for his death was Barbara. Adding to the suspicion, investigators discovered that just a week before the murder, she had learned she was still listed as the beneficiary on George's life insurance. That revelation gave her motive. For nearly 2 decades, the case languished. Then, in 2008, a breakthrough arrived. Barbara's own divorce lawyer, Manuel Martinez, confessed that he had arranged a hitman to kill George. The cost, $40,000. Bank statements, phone records, and testimony tied Barbara directly to the plan. She denied her involvement, but the evidence proved overwhelming. Investigators uncovered communications that placed her at the heart of the conspiracy. In 2010, Barbara Cogan pleaded guilty to manslaughter and related charges. She was sentenced to 12 to 36 years in prison, ultimately serving 12 before being released on parole in 2020 at the age of 77. Martinez, her attorney-turned-accomplice, was also convicted. He had even traveled with Barbara to Puerto Rico to secure the funds for the hit, and in 2008, he was sentenced to 25 years to life. The fallout for Barbara's family was devastating. She had 2 sons, Scott and William. Both struggled with the reality that their mother had orchestrated the murder of their father. At Barbara's sentencing, Scott delivered a tearful victim impact statement expressing his love for both parents, but also the deep pain of betrayal. The years since her release have brought only silence from her children. No public statements, no sign of reconciliation. Their absence speaks volumes, hinting at a fractured bond that time may never heal. As for Mary Louise Hawkins, George's mistress, her life was forever altered by the tragedy. In 1993, she left the United States for Europe, seeking refuge from the media spotlight and threats she had received. She rebuilt her life, marrying and taking a new name to protect her identity. For decades, she lived quietly, but in 2020, during Barbara's parole hearings, she spoke publicly. Her words were harsh and direct. She described Barbara as an animal and condemned her manipulative behavior, expressing outrage that she had been released. The murder of George Cogan left scars that stretched far beyond the crime scene. It fractured a family, tainted a fortune, and turned a story of wealth and ambition into one of betrayal, greed, and loss. Decades later, the name Barbara Cogan still lingers in the shadow of infamy, a reminder of how far someone might go when love turns cold and money becomes the ultimate prize. Thanks for tuning in to Unreal True Crime. If you're intrigued by mysteries from around the world, check out our new channel, Latin Crimes, where we dive into the gripping true crime stories of Latin America. Don't miss out. Subscribe now for more thrilling investigations.